everyone. Welcome to the latest webinar from the Centre for Policy Studies in place of strike. My name is Emma Revell. I'm the Head of Communications and Public Affairs at the Centre for Policy Studies, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Just a reminder that if you're watching us on Zoom, we will have a Q&A session. Once we've heard from all of our panellists and had a bit of a discussion, we'll have a Q&A from you guys towards the end, so you can put your questions in the chat box at any time, and I will come to probably my favourites. I'll run it a little bit like a dictatorship and just pick the ones I fancy towards the end of the session. So I'm delighted this morning to be joined by my colleague Mark Lehain, who is the CPS Head of Education, giving us a wave, thanks Mark. Tony Lodge, who is a Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, Dr. Billy Palmer, who is a Senior Fellow in Health Policy at the Nuffield Trust, and Jonathan Simons, who is a partner and the head of education practice at Public First, who is joining us, I believe, from the back of a cab. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We appreciate your dedication to joining us this morning. As a result, if it's okay with you, Jonathan, I won't ask you to go first, just in case you need to move at any point, but you can listen in. And I will ask Dr. Billy Palmer if you can give us your opening remarks. You've got 3 minutes. You're on the clock.
Yeah, of course. So where to start with this? I think it's worth outlining who's involved in these negotiations and who we need to have reconcile their views. So you've got union members, well, you know, the workers, you've got union leadership, you've got government departments, you've got Treasury, you've got the public, and I think there's question marks over how media have reported some of the debates here. And on top of that, you've got number 10 pay review bodies and others. So you've got a very complex picture to get an agreement. And I think we're currently in a scenario whereby some of the parties would fall behind certain pay deals that have been offered. But because you've got, you know, what started almost 365 days ago, minus a month, 330 odd days ago, it's the views have diverged. And it's now very difficult to get all those bodies on side and finding agreement. And I think it's very frustrating that it's been pretty clear from the start of nearly a year ago that there would be disputes, because I don't think it necessarily suits anyone. In fact, you could have a situation where all parties lose out in the case of industrial action. So that's the kind of context. You know, what can be done about that? You know, there are very real absolute pressures on pay because of cost of living issues, but I think also we need to be very conscious of perceptions around pay. So how do people feel that they're being valued and supported in their roles? So it's not just about an absolute level of pay, but that's important, but it's about the pay inequalities between staff groups. It's about whether they feel like they've lost pay compared to previous years. If you have quirks in the pension arrangements or national insurance payments, which suddenly mean you're paid even a few pence less than you were a previous month, that hurts people. And you've got to think about how to improve working conditions. When it comes to retention, working conditions trumps pay. Both are important. Working conditions is the most important. And to get there, there's many things that government can do in terms of that pay setting process. It's not fit for purpose. I suspect we'll get onto that. But I think unions also have a responsibility to make sure that they're providing, you know, the information to their members, which is likely to, you know, to support them to make decisions around their pay and vote in a way that, is good for them in the long run. And also probably not seek bilateral talks with number 10 if they don't think they're getting their way. So I think there's, from all parties, there's work that can be done. And I think probably most importantly, if we really are going to try to ensure we get a deal that where people perceive that they are properly valued and supported, you need to understand the motivations of the current and of the future workforces. I think most of our thinking is a little bit in the past, so based on what we thought people were wanted 2 decades ago, and sort of hoping that that's what that workforce will want now. So I think we need to move that forward. I think that's probably my 3 minutes.
Great, thanks very much, Billy. Mark, if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to go next.
Sure thing. So obviously my particular area of interest and experience is in education, and I'm sat here today in London, but where I live in Bedford, it's one of the areas where strikes are taking place today. I'm very lucky in that my 4 kids are at 3 different schools, and none of them are being affected by strikes by their own particular teachers. So I'm grateful for that. But the comments I just wanted to start with today in my 3 minutes is one around the government strategy thus far and how that's going. One about potential changes around strike thresholds after this point. And then my final thing is whether government have actually within their power to make some of the changes that I think are driving a lot of the unhappiness that we're seeing, and Billy's already picked up on some of that. So first one, in terms of the government strategy so far, maybe it's just my optimism bias or my bias generally. I think they're actually doing quite a good job, given that we are where we are now. I think we've had to let, particularly in education, these strikes roll out and see what the uptake from workers is, to see how employers and schools are coping with them, and to see where public opinion is going. Now, we shouldn't really be drawing upon anecdote, those of us that work in think tanks. What I would say is, what I'm hearing from my head teacher, Matt CEO, and other friends is that there are possibly fewer teachers striking this week than they did last month, for a variety of reasons. And now, if that is the case, although there was some initial data that came out of the regions that went on strike yesterday that suggested as many schools were disrupted as before, but I'm interested to know whether the number of teachers striking is potentially falling this week compared to a month ago, and why that might be. And if that is the case, I wonder whether the government strategy of letting things work, letting talks go on, letting people do what they feel they need to do, is going to help bring a deal to the table and agreed sooner. So that's just a question, a hypothesis I'm playing around with. In terms of what the government could do from here, I am a massive fan of us having more sectors, more of the public sector covered by minimum service standards. And I think it's a real shame that whereas the nurses union is working with the government to try and make sure that there's a minimum amount of stuff going on within hospitals and elsewhere when they're on strike, it's a real shame that in education, the teaching unions won't do that. I don't think it makes the profession look good when others can find it in themselves to do that. So I think the government should push harder on the minimum service standards in the legislation they're doing. And I think as part of that, they should probably raise the thresholds required in education and those other core public sectors to make it harder for strikes to happen, so that they can only happen if there's a genuine majority of union members keen to do that. At the moment, it's 50% turnout and 40% of members overall. I see no harm in raising that 40% to 50%. And then also, I think it's worth the government finally grappling with the issue about allowing non-union alternatives to have the right to represent workers in grievance situations at work. What I call the ADAPT type stuff. There's an organisation called ADAPT that works in schools. It is not a union, but will represent teachers and staff if they come into grievance or other conflict situations with their employers. Currently, they do not have a legal right to represent schools. I think the government should push through that and allow other organisations to come in and represent workers aside from trade unions. There's one in medicine as well, but they should do that across the whole sector. And finally, no, I think that's it actually. I've said my bit. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. Tony, would you like to come in and give us your opening comments?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to focus on the railways, which is an area we've looked at in the past at the CPS. We had a pamphlet out 2 years ago called Changing Track, which was the analysis of the economics of the railway after COVID. And 10 years ago, we actually had a pamphlet out all about increasing competition in the railway passenger market. And that, of course, was in the heyday when we doubled passenger travel in Britain since the 1930s on a network half the size. Really impressive statistics when you look back on what were actually a golden era, though at times, of course, it didn't feel like it was. The fundamental point about the rail strikes is that they are the most political of the lot. And I would argue that the government has made 2 mistakes. It has allowed Mick Lynch and the RMT particularly, and I'll come on to the way that union works, to effectively position the government as if it is being particularly unreasonable and it is negotiating from a position of weakness, when actually the government should be negotiating from a position of strength. There are some alarming statistics on the rail network at the moment. The season ticket market is just 28% of what it was before COVID. It hasn't recovered. Revenue is around 175 million pounds lower each month than it was before the pandemic. 70% of income over the past 2 years to keep railways running has come from the Treasury, from the taxpayer. And perhaps more damning, is, depending on how one appreciates the statistic, at the moment only 2% of all journeys that are taken by the public are on trains. Now, those are really alarming statistics. We have a problem which I think the government has allowed itself to be pulled onto the punch, whereas it has allowed ministers to negotiate directly with the union when it should have been left to the train operating companies. And that then allows Lynch to present this as a political battle. That was the first mistake. It blinked first. The second mistake is we have a sector here which costs a lot of money, the costs are going up, and we have a union which is seeking to arm lock the government into A, giving it more money, in a sector which actually requires radical surgery. There are two things the government can do, primarily. It can look at the strike numbers, and Mark's point was very valid there. Over Christmas, a lot of RMT workers, chaps, went back to work, didn't get much coverage. RMT looks after track maintenance and signallers. The signallers don't really have a problem with the government, the track maintenance people do. The signallers, I understand, want to go back to work. Now, that's interesting in itself, that needs to be better exploited. The other interesting thing about the passenger network with the drivers, that's ASLEF. The private sponsored companies on the railways, the open access operators, aren't on strike. They are running so long as the signals are working. ASLEF are on strike. ASLEF drivers are driving trains which are, in some cases, 60% quieter than they were 2 years ago. I won't prattle on right now. I know we can have a Q&A, but I think there are three solutions. One is you re-timetable the network and you fill a lot of undercapacity slots with freight. Freight is a massive sector for Britain. We do not need to move anything like enough freight by rail, and the government does have a future of freight white paper. The second is we need to approve much more open access competition and de-unionize the passenger railway network. That isn't some kind of heretic comment from the mid-80s where we go to battle with these people, but they need to better understand the weakness of their sector and what needs to happen to bring it back to health. And the third point is we need to fundamentally understand in 2023 what the railways are for. It isn't that long ago that the whole of the London and South East commuter market used to prop up the rest of the network because of its season ticket fare income. That has collapsed. We therefore need to better understand where we can grow the network. Intercity long distance leisure market's massive, but we better need to understand that the people who are asking for more, and Mick Lynch did not put the latest offer to his members, his executive rejected it, important, but they need to fundamentally understand they are negotiating from a position of weakness. That doesn't mean we all go in with the battle axe, as it were, but we need to fundamentally negotiate from a position of strength.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm delighted today Jonathan appears to have found a stable stationary seat, which is excellent timing. Jonathan, if you want to give us your opening comments.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And yes, apologies for my slightly erratic journey, blame London travel and the inability to get around. So I wanted to make 4 points, and again, particularly thinking here about education strikes and school teachers in particular. I think the first one is that fundamentally, if a union exists to protect its members' pay and conditions, then this is about the most justified strike you can have. Teacher trade unions occasionally sort of range beyond their brief in education and opine on all sorts of things, which are not really to do with their members' pay and conditions. They're to do with, curriculum and assessment and war in Palestine and the like, which is really nothing to do with them. But actually, fundamentally, if you exist as a teacher union to protect your members' pay and conditions, then teachers are in a relatively poor space. Teacher pay has declined quite considerably in real terms since 2010, both for teachers and for new teachers coming in. And relatedly, conditions, which we've talked about, are also difficult. Workload is very, very high. Vacancy rates for teachers are quite high. The numbers of people wanting to train as teachers every year is consistently below government targets. Retention is a significant problem. So on the face of it, the union has a reasonable case to say that its members are not being treated well, that pay and conditions are bad, and that this is having a real world detrimental impact on schools and indeed then on parents and teachers and children. The second point I would make is that under the circumstances, it's interesting that the polling is reasonably evenly split. So at Public First, we've done various polls on how much the general population supports each of the strikes. Teacher strikes are not massively popular. They're more or less split 50-50 between the general public thinking that they're justified or not. Parents are slightly more sympathetic. which is interesting because, of course, parents are the ones who are the most acutely disadvantaged, but potentially they're also the ones that see the kind of detrimental effects. But it is not a slam dunk for either government or the teaching unions at the moment. That is one of the reasons why I suspect the position is essentially in stasis at the moment, because neither side particularly has an incentive to move. If you're the trade unions, you want to demonstrate that you have a power. One of the points that Mark made earlier, I think, is very interesting. That the teacher trade unions have had called for 7 days of strikes. If those start to wither away, if we get to a point where, like UCU in the university sector, they have a rolling program of strikes that essentially nobody complies with, their negotiating power goes down. On the other hand, if you're the government and the trade unions do manage to successfully deliver 7 days of action, you may feel under greater pressure to concede. I think the third point I would make is it's also not a surprise that the government generally is taking a long time to respond on this. And one of the reasons for this is essentially negotiation 101. I've never really understood people that say, well, it's obvious that the government will need to settle in some way, so why don't they just do it immediately? And the answer is, well, because if they do it immediately, then all you do is increase the incentives for someone to strike again the next time. In some sense, you have to hold out for a period of time. You have to raise the frictional cost and the direct financial cost of public sector workforces, because that is the way in which, as government, you triangulate protecting public sector workers and protecting the interests of taxpayers. Government has an interest to do both of those things. So whilst it may want to pay nurses or teachers more or otherwise improve their conditions, they can't simply say yes on day one, because all that does is encourages another strike on day 2 and day 3. So I don't think it's a surprise that it hasn't been a settlement, but I do think finally there will probably be some form of settlement in and around the budget. I suspect the headroom that has been found for Jeremy Hunt will allow him to make various sort of one-off retrospective payments that don't then bake it into the baseline, but are nevertheless probably enough to buy off sufficient numbers of workers that even if the unions themselves kind of remain in formal dispute, sufficient members are mollified such that the unions won't be able to take people out. But it is not a satisfactory situation for either public sector workforces or the government to find itself in. This is not a happy state of affairs. I suspect most union leaders don't particularly want to be in entrenched warfare. Possible that the rail union is slightly different, but I don't get the impression that certainly the nurses union, for example, which we haven't talked about particularly, are essentially begging for a settlement. I mean, every time they go on the radio, they're essentially asking the government, pleading and begging with them. They're reducing their demands steadily. They're desperate to settle. So I don't think this is a satisfactory situation, but it may well be that at least in the short term, a bit of cash in and around the budget will at least buy off some of this first round of strikes.
Very interesting points. Thank you so much. One thing I wanted to ask Jonathan, actually quickly, before I get on to the other questions, and a reminder that if you're watching on Zoom, you can drop your questions in the Q&A at any time, and we'll get to those once we've got through mine. Mark suggested that he would back restrictions on industrial action or more rigid, higher thresholds for education. How do you feel about that, you know, from an education perspective?
So I wouldn't personally do that, no. I think that actually the thresholds are pretty high. So you have the sort of standard 2 thresholds of that most trade unions have to abide by under the existing law, and then you have a kind of 3rd threshold of critical national infrastructure. And we know it's hard to hit that because one of the teaching unions didn't make it, the head teacher union didn't make it, and the other head teacher union has not gone out because essentially they didn't think they would make it. So I think we already do have quite a high bar for action. And I'm not convinced that greater restriction fundamentally would solve the issue, which is that if you have a very discontented workforce, I mean, we know what is happening in schools. People are literally voting with their feet, and we have significant vacancies in the school teacher workforce. So that, to me, is an issue that you don't solve necessarily with greater laws.
Billy, I suppose one of the reasons that we're talking about this is that the Royal College of Nurses have voluntarily put in place minimum standards for their strikes, and therefore it draws attention to other strikes and other unions who don't put those in place. How do you feel that sort of minimum standards for industrial action would play in the health sector?
Yeah, well, I guess it's probably worth reflecting on what's the impact of strikes normally. So we have had these are not common. I mean, it's fairly unprecedented to get this sort of level of striking we've got at the moment. It's worth reflecting on that. But there have been strikes before, particularly for junior doctors. And we see from that, typically there's not a noticeable or measurable impact on inpatient mortality, for example, but you do get fewer people turning up. either attendances, A&E, or admissions, and you get more cancellations. So when we're thinking about minimum standards, well, what's the health service trying to achieve? Well, it's trying to deal with that emergency care, and that is something that the minimum standards that have been put in place are trying to deal with. But also, it's facing a pretty big backlog at the moment. And so you've currently got a situation whereby you're just making that larger and larger by strike by strike. So I think there's something there to to be thinking about. What is the long-term implication? I'm not, in terms of what should be done on this. There are of course risks and benefits of trying to change the threshold and what the minimum requirements would be. I'm not aware of any particularly robust evidence of what works and what that balance should be. So it's very difficult to comment, and therefore you're moving back to a position of what we do know is that how can we put in place the condition to avoid the strikes in the first place.
That is probably where we should be starting, but we're too far down that road at this stage. Mark, I suspect you might want to come back on some of the things that Jonathan said about teachers' pay and conditions, but can I also ask what impact a pay rise for teachers would have on the economy in terms of how much it would cost to give teachers a pay rise?
So you would, certainly if so there's an extra £2 billion going into the school's budget for the next academic year, and that was announced in the autumn statement, and that was but that was not making any assumptions about the likely pay rises for next year coming along. A significant, about 80% of school income goes on staff salaries. So if you're going to see a 5% increase in that, I'm going to my head. Oh, don't laugh at me, Jonathan. And as a former maths teacher, my mind's gone blank. It's going to be significant. There would need to be, if there was going to be a pay rise above the 3.5% that has been proposed by the government to the latest pay review board, there will need to be a pay grant to go alongside it, because otherwise schools will, rightly or wrongly, and I whenever they talk about unfunded pay rises, I get a bit cross, because I think, well, what do you think the extra money is going to go on? Like, it's meant to go on salaries and stuff. It's not unfunded. But even moderate people I know in the system are starting to talk about unfunded pay rises. So that would not be tenable for the government. There would have to be some kind of pay grant for next year to fund the additional, the extra bit on top of the pay rise over what they're proposing right now. To come back to the point about whether we should make it harder for people to strike or not, and whether that's the right thing to do. For me, it's about the fact that if I'm an Audi shopper, I don't know how many people have made the switch to Audi. It's great, you should try. If Audi staff go on strike, I can pop to the Sainsbury's next door. Okay, I have alternatives. If my teachers' kids go on strike, I do not have an alternative. If things are done by the public sector, it's normally because they need to be done by the public sector, because it's the best way to do it, and normally it's because there is some form of monopoly of provision for that service or that good. And hence it's a very special place to be, the public sector, and with it comes certain responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to give continuity of service, because people build their lives around it and their children's lives around it. And therefore, I don't have a problem with the public sector rules for strikes being different to those for the private sector, because almost by definition, if the public sector is doing it, there is not an alternative. And so there are extra responsibilities that come with that. Politically, I also think that would play quite well if the government were to go down that route.
Tony, how do you feel about possible minimum standards in the rail industry? Because as you said, some providers, some train providers were not having strikes. They were completely running as normal. There's a varied picture across the country in terms of how rail strikes impact, but also what impact are rail strikes specifically having on the economy? Because as you say, a lot of journeys that are taken are not taken by rail. I think people will understand and potentially be impacted in their day-to-day life if the NHS or health workers are on strike, or if schools are on strike, because either they're on a waiting list and it's frustrating, or they're wondering how to get their kids to school. But for a lot of people, trains are not a big part of their daily life. So what is the impact of train strikes?
So that's a really important point. So this is not the weapon. 41 years ago, in 1982, we had our first national rail strike since World War II, when the old National Union of Railwaymen walked out in July of 82 in a complete national shutdown. They were back at work within 4 days because the Thatcher government said, we are prepared to endure this for as long as necessary. It was just after the Falklands War. She was on a massive high, and we're prepared to endure this. The damage will be when you further run down the number of people who choose to use rail. And they were back at work within 4 days. It was quite a big event at the time. Now, what is a really important point here is that people are now have choices. Mick Lynch is not negotiating like a man called Sid Green was in 1982, when he could actually bring a very large portion of, particularly industry in those days. The whole of the power sector relied on coal being moved by rail to power stations from coal mines. The whole of many other sectors had a rail dimension. They don't anymore. Lots of people right now are working from home, particularly in the once lucrative Southeast England, London commuter market. They might come in on a Tuesday or Wednesday or even a Thursday. They've lopped off Monday and Friday. They don't come in the peaks. They will arrive at the office after, say, 11:15, and therefore that once lucrative season ticket market, where you might pay £8,000 a year to go between Winchester and Waterloo in the peak, that's gone. The person either isn't doing it or can travel outside the peaks. So the treasury income has collapsed. So the reliance on rail to get to work became quite significant again up until 2020. A lot of people had chosen rail over the car, and a sector which, by the way, often gets forgotten about because it used to be quite big, and believe it or not, it's got very big again, is coach. There's been a huge boom for things like National Express, and the coaches on the M4 and the M6 and the M1, they're doing very well because they're actually able to sell cheaper tickets, and they are able to basically say, if you do want to travel on a coach for 4 hours between London and York and not an hour 50 on a train, which might not run, get the coach. So
you'll get a seat on a coach as well. You're probably not going to be stood up the entire journey.
There's that as well. Now, so the whole point here is, and this is where I think Mick Lynch is leading, I'm afraid, some very, very, very decent, good, hardworking rail workers, Aslef and Mick Lynch, are leading some very, very, very hardworking and good people down a slippery slope. Because the Secretary of State said one thing which was quite significant, and I think it got missed at his Bradshaw address in early February at 1 Great George Street, a very busy packed event. He said, look, this is not sustainable. We won't keep throwing money at it, because if we keep having these strikes, which are very deliberately planned to affect long weekends or the public bank holidays which are coming up, you can see how they choose the dates. It's very clear and obvious. That then affects a massive part of railway income. It affects regions when people might be having a long weekend break. It affects sporting events. The last one was deliberately timed to affect things like Twickenham and other sporting events. So all of that's there. There's going to clearly one affect the Cheltenham Festival in mid-March. So what they're doing is Mick Lynch is telling his people, if you stick with it, I'll get you 11%. You've got to stick with me. But a lot of his members can see that actual reason for having a job is falling away beneath them. So it is, and I do hate these parallels, people bandy them around, but anyone who knows anything about the coal strike in 1985 should know that the chaps eventually went back to work because they knew they might not have a job at the end of it, or they certainly might not have a job in 5 years. They were right, by the way, they didn't, because the government looked at alternatives and it wasn't prepared to keep the subsidy going for a sector which was not regarded as reliable. And customers, key word here, customers. I don't know, it doesn't quite work in the education sense, but passengers are customers. If they chose to go somewhere else or use another transport platform or not even travel, then it is not the government's responsibility or duty to subsidize a sector which is exceptionally expensive. Rail is becoming a lot more expensive, all to do with the leasing of rolling stock and track provision and more digitalization, and the whole cost of Great British Railways is phenomenal. If we hadn't had COVID, we would have been in a much stronger position because we felt the government would have been able to negotiate with the unions on a much more balanced perspective around growth. And what are we going to be looking like growth-wise and income-wise, say, in 2025? The unions need to be treated in the rail sector a little bit more of an understanding that they are not negotiating from a position of strength. 9% is exceptionally generous. They were all furloughed, a point which is important. They were all furloughed, they were all looked after, at great expense. Rail capacity collapsed by 94% during COVID. And the fundamental point here is that I think you'll find, and again, the Secretary of State said it in his Bradshaw lecture, I don't want to look at cuts. We're coming up on the 60th anniversary of Beeching. We don't want to look at cuts, 1963, but make no mistake, the situation is unsustainable. If everybody thinks they're just going to come back to work with an 11% settlement and keep driving trains around or maintaining trains where in some cases they are 60% down on usage, and track capacity is expensive, you actually buy capacity, it's let, then I think we should be looking at alternatives. We should be looking at letting that underused capacity used for freight. Many of the big container ports are constantly saying to the Secretary of State, can we please get slots to get our trains on? We can move containers between Southampton, Leeds and Scotland, but we can't get on because of the passenger network and no space. Well, there is space, and it's space which should be let as a consequence of underused passenger trains, some of which are moving around in the afternoon in the southeast, which are near empty.
One thing that quite a few of you have mentioned is that a lot of these strikes are represented, I think, primarily in the media as about pay, and pay is an important component of that, but it's not just about pay, it's also about conditions, especially in the NHS and in schools. So if we set aside pay rises for a second, what other ways can the unions, the government and the departments that are responsible support the workers who run strike in their conditions rather than their pay? Jonathan, we'll start with you and teachers.
So I think this is a really important part of the picture, both because it doesn't have a direct financial cost to government. It's a productivity gain through a non-pay settlement, which is really, really important. But also because, again, I'm thinking particularly in education, it is one of the major drivers. So despite the fact that teachers have had declining pay for 2010, up until at least a couple of years ago, when you ask people why they either weren't becoming teachers or why they were leaving the profession, they didn't say pay. They said behaviour, pupil behaviour, and they said workload. In other words, if you can improve non-pay conditions, there is a good reason to believe that you would both significantly improve recruitment and retention of teachers. Now, again, the difficulty for the government in this case, and in many of the public sector, is that actually they don't control all the levers for this. So there are some schools and groups of schools that are incredibly good at improving pupil behaviour. There are some schools and groups of schools that are incredibly good at removing nugatory workload. And we know this, and we can see schools literally cheek by jowl in the same town with the same pupil population, same demographics, same funding settlement. And some teachers are working fewer hours, and some teachers have significantly better pupil behaviour, and some don't. So we know it is possible to do. But it's also quite hard for the Secretary of State for Education to make an offer to the teacher trade unions that says, I, sitting in my building in Whitehall, will remove workload, or I will improve pupil behaviour, because she doesn't have the levers to do so. But to the extent that she can, and to the extent that they can in the NHS and elsewhere, I think an offer that is based predominantly around improving conditions would be an excellent way to go.
Mark is doing a lot of very vigorous nodding, so if you want to come in next.
I couldn't agree more, and that was the third point that I was going to make at the start, but I forgot. The government doesn't have the levers, but they can facilitate and get together people to work on workload. That was done very successfully a few years ago. The teacher workload survey in 2019 showed that on average, primary school teachers had seen their working hours come down by more than 5 hours a week as a result of various changes. It's still very high, but it was coming down a lot lower. I read a very interesting article on the last strike day in one of the sector newspapers that took a load of quotes from teachers on picket lines about why they were striking. And I had a wry smile to myself as I read what they were striking about, because aside from the obvious thing about pay, nearly all their grumbles they had were things that were nothing to do with government, but down to the people running their schools. And because they'd named the schools in that article, I went and looked at these schools' financial situation and so on, courtesy of the DfE's very useful transparency website. And I could see straight away that those teachers that were moaning about workload and pay were at schools that on average were paying their teachers far more than national and local averages, and they were spending far less of the school's money on resources for departments and learning resources for children. And what were those teachers complaining about? How little money they had in their departmental budget to buy stuff for kids. That's not the government's decision, that is a management decision. And one of the big disappointments for me has been the head teacher trade unions not taking responsibility for their own members' decisions, a lot of which are driving this disgruntlement. Now, you might argue, well, why would they do that publicly? But we really need to see the head teacher unions step up to the mark if they want to be part of the solution to this situation.
Billy, I suppose when we talk about working conditions, it's emotive when it comes to teachers. It's especially emotive after the pandemic when it comes to healthcare workers. So what can, if anything, unions, government, local health organisations, what can they do to help make things better for frontline health workers?
Yeah, so I guess a general point here is that we have a pretty poor understanding of some of these aspects about working conditions and actually what could improve things. And that's, I mean, that just needs to be sorted out as a first thing. It's pretty inexcusable. It's very easy to be correct this information in a better way. There are stuff really trying to improve working conditions, understanding what's happening. So, but we do know why people are leaving, for example. So both nurses and doctors, you get issues like being under too much pressure, inflexibility of hours, issues around the working environment, feeling unable to do a good job. Some of those are tricky to deal with because if you've got limited control over demand and limited control over the supply of staff coming in, it's very difficult to release that pressure quickly. But there are some things you can do. I mean, they have recruited vast numbers of people from overseas in the last few years, and the NHS has seen a large increase in staffing. So, but there has to probably be a recognition of the onboarding costs are non-negligible. So bringing people into a service is not necessarily easy. So there is friction in the first place, but hopefully that if we continue to see those trends, you need to, more broadly, just err on the side of oversupply. It's been reckless in the past where we've had workforce planning that has, there've been times where they've thought we'll probably need fewer nurses in the future, and therefore they've not tried to increase the number of clinical placements and the numbers in training. I mean, that was, you didn't have to wait for hindsight to see that was probably a bad idea. And so we've got ourselves in this position. Just in terms of that working environment, particularly in primary care, where you've got, very sort of dispersed and a large number of employers, that seems to be an issue. How do you get that capital expenditure to make sure people are working in a nice environment? And there are things you can do. There are sort of, when you're commissioning services, you can set some expectations on employers about what they'll provide, and make sure that they are, doing these additional things to pay to make sure that people have a, have a good job and good working conditions around it.
Tony, I'll come to you about pay in just a second, but Billy, in your introductory comments, you talked about the NHS pay review process specifically. Yeah. Do you want to just explain to the people tuned in what exactly is wrong with it and how you think it could be improved?
Yeah, so it's incredibly important, this pay review process. I think most people would want to remove the sort of the politics out of pay, and so we've got a scenario at the moment where you have once a year you'll have a published report for doctors and then one for other staff in the NHS, and you read 230 pages and you get to a recommendation and you've got literally no idea what the recommendation will say based on the previous 230 pages. And it's not, this is not an issue just to the pay review body writing that report. They're being hamstrung by their remit and the resources they have available. The timings are fairly ludicrous. Quite often they're published way into the actual year in which the pay's meant to come in. You've got sometimes some like long-term pay deals where there's no force majeure clause if things fall outside sort of acceptable parameters. You've got the junior doctor contract was signed 3 years ago based on 2% a year. No one predicted a pandemic and inflation to be the level it is. And it seems very unreasonable to say, oh, we agreed this 3 years ago. We want long-term conditions or long-term pay settlements. It allows stability and know what people are working towards. But that shouldn't just be used as a sort of excuse to not revisit things and not think people probably, you could argue sort of fairly. There's very sort of limited understanding on actually how pay affects recruitment, both domestically, internationally, and retention within it. Sort of very vague statements in terms of numbers of leaders. Very vague statements in terms of when it comes to affordability. Some of the money that goes in will come back in terms of additional taxes. And I think there needs to be a better recognition. It's very annoying for the public to hear, oh, but that, that money is held in a different balance sheet to this other money. What, I mean, for most people as a taxpayer, they care about, the overall public purse. And I think it's pretty inexcusable that that pay review process as a whole isn't thinking through. There's various other elements we think they could be improving on this. And in fact, the pay review, the chair of the NHS pay review body is even accepted that there's things that can be improved on that level. So it seems to me like an easy win for government to say, okay, we recognise there needs to be some improvements in this pay review process to make it more intelligent and come up with better conclusions. And I think that's one of the ways that in addition to pay, you could try to reach some sort of settlement there.
And indeed avoid future strikes potentially if people have a bit more trust in the system. Tony, when it comes to not pay conditions on the railways, is that something that the unions care about, or are they primarily driven by the pay question?
It's twofold on the railways. It's pay and getting what the RMT particularly and ASLEF think they can get, but it's also working practices. So when we were in the good times, up until the pandemic, when again we'd had this massive growth, we had doubled passenger numbers in 20 years, between 1994 and 2019. Passenger numbers had doubled. It's extraordinary achievement, all sorts of reasons for it, but it had happened. It did happen. And that actually cushioned and smothered over, you might say, a number of problems and long-standing legacy issues which had never been addressed. The pandemic forced all these issues very much out into the open when the economics of the railway effectively collapsed. So we have, for anyone who's tried to use a West Coast main line recently between Euston and the northwestern Scotland, the Avanti West Coast saga is very much down to an archaic railway around weekend rostering, overtime, and this stuff dates back to the late 1990s. That should have been addressed a long time ago, and it's come to the fore after the pandemic. We have an issue where track maintenance workers, which are represented by RMT, are arguing they aren't properly paid, but actually they are, according to the ONS, they are one of the most well-rewarded skilled trades occupations. Interestingly, and I think this could be something we start reading about quite soon, the signallers at Network Rail, which is a different sector, not becoming too detailed, they are very concerned that they might not be getting their 9%, when they're quite happy to get 9%. The track maintenance bit of RMT want to hold out for 11%. And that's where I can see cracks beginning to emerge. The final point I'd make is, you also have a job security angle here, which I think should be played up much better, particularly on the railways. I made the point earlier that people who work on the railways are skilled men and women. They see the numbers, they'll have seen the numbers decline, they'll know that the 840 between Basingstoke and Waterloo is nothing like as busy as it used to be. They can see it. They can see the issue of the customer and the market base. It isn't there like it used to be. There is therefore a question about job security and for how much longer can this continue this way. That should be better played. It should be better propagated, if that's the right word, amongst by the talks for train operating companies and ministers, because ultimately that can't be maintained on the frequencies and on the capacity levels it is at, with a £200 million subsidy a month, and Treasury, ultimately the key department as ever in all of this, refusing in due course to keep signing the cheque.
Thanks, Tony. We've got just over 15 minutes left, so I'm going to switch to questions in the Q&A. There's one from Adam Smith. I'm not sure if that's the individual or the institute, but hi, Adam, either way. Which he's written, how do you think Starmer's Labour will deal differently with unions? Do you think it will lead to fewer or more strikes? A particularly interesting question of how the Labour Party would deal with strikes. Billy, do you have any sort of faith in Starmer's ability to cope?
Well, you can only speculate on these things. Yeah, I think it's worth reflecting just outside of purely the politics. I think we're in an era now where independent, like objective commentary on strikes is competing with Reddit forums. So I think whatever political party you have in place, you've still got this issue about, can we start with a sufficiently shared understanding of the pressures to then get a negotiated deal? And just to give an example of this, depending on whether I use a 1 decade or 2 decade trend, and depending on whether I use RPI or CPI as your measure of inflation, I can get up to the start of this, the previous pay settlement, nurse real terms paid to be -10%, -3%, or +6%. Now, unless we get some shared understanding of how are we measuring these things, then people have such a different starting point. It's impossible to get any agreement. And whilst the different political persuasions might better handle unions and those industrial relations, I fear there's an underlying context that needs to be addressed as well to make sure we can have some sort of shared understanding about pay and conditions.
It's an incredibly good point. When we hear data being thrown about, you can make statistics say almost anything. Mark, I know you've written a little bit about Keir Starmer's sort of education mission. How do you think he'll cope?
It's hard to say, and probably Jonathan will have a much more informed, sensible take on this than me. But I mean, even under the last Labour government, the then National Union of Teachers was calling members out on strike over pay. I think even in 2008, when teacher pay was almost at the highest level it had ever been, it still wasn't enough for the NUT. So the big advantage Labour will have is that relationship with the trade unions, and that's not really going to go anywhere, I think, and that could work in people's favour in terms of being able to back channel stuff and avoid strikes. But I mean, Jonathan, you'll have a better, more informed view on this.
So I think there's a couple of things that are worth thinking about. One is that, of course, a lot of the unions are not formally affiliated to the Labour Party anymore because they think that Starmer is sort of, milquetoast and Blairite and all these other things, which I think are good things, and apparently they think are bad things. I think fundamentally, a lot depends on, if Labour get into power, what the size of their majority or minority is. Because, if it is a Starmer-led government, he will have 30 or 40 MPs on his backbenches who are members of, Socialist Campaign Group and the like, who are going on picket lines, who are absolutely lockstep for sort of double-digit pay increases. And if he's dependent on them for votes, not on pay settlements, but on all other kinds of things, then they are going to wield a degree of power. If he manages to have a 50, 60, 70 seat majority, he can afford to let them, fulminate from the backbenches. At the moment, the positioning is very, very clear. Political parties stand for power; they don't stand for the picket line. Here's a more elegant phrase than that, but I think it's very good. Certainly, people like Wes Streeting are absolutely campaigning on, not giving in to the workers, and he's picking fights with the BMA in favour of patients and all these other kinds of, what I think are very, very smart positioning. So I think a lot will depend on the circumstances, but Starmer and the team around him will want to define themselves, at least in part, against trade unions, precisely to show that it's not, same old Labour. So their instinct will be, whilst being conciliatory in tone, to not give away significant amounts of money, not least because it'll make all the rest of their sums fall apart, and Rachel Reeves will go crazy on them. So I suspect, if people are hanging around for a double-digit pay settlement under a Labour Secretary of State, they may be disappointed.
I've got 2 questions in the chat on a very similar note. One of them says, why has government been so reluctant to point out that everyone, not just the public sector, is facing the same inflation, same energy prices? And why are they so reluctant to even mention the vastly superior public sector pensions? And then the second question says, what account should be taken of what seems to be a rather privileged or a generous position, pension position for NHS staff, but I think that's true of other areas represented on this call as well. Just saying that people can't, use their retirement money now, they need money to live now, and that it's a saved cost that needs to be considered separately to pay, doesn't seem to be the answer. Mark, I know this is something you've talked about, so we'll start with you. How much do we need to take into account pensions as well as pay?
Well, I mean, in the real world and in the private sector, you can't separate pension contributions and their value from pay because it's all part of the remuneration package. And there is no doubt that, I think, was it the ONS I saw, the IFS has some stats that showed that basically when you account for pension contributions, public sector workers are still typically paid 6% more than their equivalent in the private sector. It's not as big as it used to be, the advantage, but it's certainly still bigger. I did some analysis looking at the overall value in real terms of teachers' packages once you take into account pensions, and that massively reduces the amount by which they fall, and whether you use RPI or CPI. So it does make a difference, but I totally get it. If you're a teacher right now, you don't see that pension contribution. So this is my chance to plug some CPS work that was done previously that talked about maybe we should allow more flexibility in public sector pensions. Perhaps, when I was a special advisor, the civil service contribution to my pension was, I think, 30%. That's pretty huge. I think my contribution was 7.35%. And so, like, if you could be more flexible about how that 30% from the government, whether I could have taken more that was pay up front and had a smaller pension, that would be really helpful. But I do realise that saying that is easy. Doing it's really hard because the Treasury rely on, for a lot of these schemes that are unfunded, current contributions to pay for current pensioners. But I think we've got to grapple with that. So maybe an outcome of these current range of swathe of strikes is to review how public sector pensions work. But to be clear, not because I think we should try and reduce the value, because I think they are an important part of the package and that's great, but maybe the flexibility about how people take it.
Billy, would you agree with that? When we talk about NHS pensions, how generous are they, and should that be taken into account?
I do agree with Mark's point here about the flexibility of these payments and how they're perceived. You've got people coming into the workforce who have got eye-watering debts, typically, and then often, for lots of these clinical, they've been told, broadly average graduate salary, sometimes, particularly for doctors, with the promise that in the future they'll have an extremely high salary compared to most other workplaces. And then we have this very expensive pension scheme, which, if you look at the stats on it, it seems to mainly cause senior clinicians to stop working. I mean, it doesn't seem like a particularly good value for money program there. And it should be a good selling point. But agreeing with Mark's point here that they need to review how that's working. To what extent is it motivating people to go into the public sector versus other professions? And that's particularly acute in the NHS, where you've got competition from independent providers and private healthcare organisations who are trying to tempt people away with a different balance of pay and wider pension contributions. So it has to be reviewed because it's a huge amount of money and investment that goes into it, and I'm not sure it's achieving the outcomes we'd want from it.
I've got two similar questions, but in slightly different ways. Tony, one of our anonymous attendees, has said we have unfilled posts in teaching and especially in nursing, but there's no evidence that I'm aware of unfilled posts on the railways. Is that correct? Are we suffering from a shortage of railway workers?
No, railways are fully manned and fully staffed. One could argue they're slightly overmanned and overstaffed, but they are fully manned and fully staffed. And again, they had full furlough. That's rail maintenance, that's train operating crews, that is the back room staff, that is, don't forget, a large part of the estate is ticket officers still, particularly on the main line. No, the answer to that is it's fully manned and fully crewed, yeah.
And then Fiona has said, the education workforce has never been bigger. There was a net increase of 4,400 teachers last year alone. There are clearly specific areas where recruitment is difficult, but isn't the idea that teachers are leaving in droves a myth? Jonathan.
Well, I mean, sort of, yes and no. And, statistics here, like a drunk using a lamppost. So we consistently have 40% of all teachers leaving within 5 years of joining the profession, which is not ideal just from an efficiency viewpoint, because the state has paid a decent amount for them to be trained, and half of them leaving is just a very wasteful mechanism of a leaky bucket. We do have a sort of net increase of teachers, but of course we also have a net increase of students. So it's about the sort of the number of people needed for the population. We have systematically, absolutely, a shortage in particular subjects, unsurprisingly, the areas where relative pay outside of teaching is higher. So if you have a physics degree, you can earn considerably more doing almost anything than teaching. And unsurprisingly, we don't have many physics graduates wanting to go into teaching. And we have shortages in other types of subjects as well. But again, you know, it's complicated by the fact that systematically we are also not hitting our recruitment figures. So the government has a complicated model every year, which takes account of people leaving and says, therefore, this is how many people we need to come in to replace. And we miss that target every single year, which of course means the next year the target is even bigger, and we, hey presto, we miss it by even more. So it genuinely is an issue. I mean, it has in some senses been an issue for about 50 years. The only thing that ever fills the teaching workforce is when we go into a recession. Because again, what happens in a recession? Well, the relative value of teaching as a profession goes up. It's not surprising that teachers are incredibly economically rational. When things like bursaries, payments for teacher training goes up, more people go into teaching. When you can get a better job outside the economy, fewer people go into teaching. When the private sector takes a downturn, more people go into teaching. So teaching is incredibly responsive to economic incentives, despite the fact that teachers slightly bristle at this and say that they're altruistic. I mean, the truth is they are both. Most teachers can earn more money elsewhere, but nevertheless, relatively small economic shifts lead to more people going in and out. The same applies to pensions as well. The pension is an attractive part of the package, but honestly, if you speak to the average teacher in their 20s or 30s in a focus group, they don't actually conceptualize the pension as having much worth. They don't really think they're going to get it. They recognize that it's essentially going to pay for, you know, currently retired teachers. So Treasury rules notwithstanding, if you can give teachers in their 20s and 30s the option of taking some of their pension early as cash, which is complicated, I think it is a really, really good idea, because the Treasury is paying out a large amount of money for this at the moment every year. And it has been done in the US, for example. They've done it in Washington, DC. They offer two pathways for teachers. You can take the route that has a lower salary and a higher pension, or you can take the route that has a higher salary and a lower pension, and you opt into whichever system you want. And it's an incredibly attractive offer to some people. If you don't want it, you have to take it. If you're in the system already and you want to keep your pension, that's absolutely fine. Nobody's forcing you to move across. But I think if it's possible to think slightly more creatively about a system like that, it would be well worth looking at.
One final question, and given the, I've just got two more final questions, but we may not have time for both, but I'll squeeze the last one in. May not be able to answer this, but one of our guests has asked, how do you see the police position regarding pay rises, given that there's been a real terms pay cut for police since 2010, but police officers cannot strike? I know this is no one's area of expertise, but does anyone have any thoughts on, you know, the areas, industries and sectors that can't strike and what they can do? Do you believe it's right that they can't strike? I imagine the answer is yes, but if anyone wants to come in on that quickly.
It just raises that point I made earlier on, which is there are some things in the public sector that we have to accept are different to working in the private sector, because they have a unique role in society, and therefore we need them to do certain things come what may, and therefore there's certain things that they can't do, which might be, in the case of the police, strike at all, or I would argue nurses and teachers not strike so easily. But then the flip side to that is traditionally we've looked after those sectors by making sure that there are other mechanisms by which we can ensure that they're paid well and looked after well, and hence, you know, the police federation and the role that has, and so on and so forth. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think the police is a model we could look at for how we could do other bits of the public sector and keep the show on the road there.
I can see Tony nodding. Is there anything you wanted to add, or are you just agreeing with Mark?
Yeah, I'm agreeing with that.
Great, fantastic. I've got 2 minutes. I'm squeezing the last question. What would the increase be demanded by the unions and others for the state of having to take over top-up funding of pension schemes? Is that something anyone wants to come in on? I haven't read the entire question, so I may have misunderstood that. Apologies, Michael, for the question. Okay, we'll skip that one. I just want to say thank you very much to all the panelists for attending, to all of our attendees. Don't forget to sign up to the CPS newsletter on cps.org.uk. We've got 2 webinars planned for next week, so make sure you check out our social media and our newsletter for those as well. The excellent reports that Tony mentioned that he's written for the CPS are available on the CPS website. Mark has written an almost unending stream of CapEx articles. So if you go to capex.co, you can read all of his various pieces on strikes, and I'm sure we can find Billy Palmer's work on the Nuffield Trust website. Potentially Billy is nodding, and Jonathan's, if you go to Public First, where he is the head of education practice, I'm sure all of his work is on there. Thank you very much to our attendees on the Zoom for tuning in, and the panelists for joining me this afternoon.